Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. Today we are welcoming to the podcast Professor Mark Paul from Rutgers University, who has just written a new book called Ends of Freedom: Reclaiming America's Lost Promise of Economic Rights. And this is a book which is pretty much what it says on the tin.
To be fair, it's The Ends of Freedom. If you think the article is really important, The Ends of Freedom.
Yeah. But you know, we're talking about, you know, reconfiguring American society away from low tax neoliberalism up to high tax social democracy. You know, a broad guarantee of social rights for housing, education, healthcare, basic income, all the good stuff that we know and love. And situating it in an American context, that's, legible and readable.
It's true. Actually, it's quite a good read. Nice mix of history. Really it moves, and yet it has a lot of policy details, historical details, and very strong evidence and arguments in favor of this normative vision. So not just this is how things should be, but these are the reasons why the opposing view is nonsense, both empirically, economically, and normatively. So he does a nice takedown of Friedman and Hayek, and you know, you see some of our faves: Thomas Paine, FDR, Martin Luther King, and a number of other historical figures along the way, right?
Yeah. And, at the risk of self-flattery, I think this is a similar type of effort to my book, you know, where you're trying to connect up normative moral philosophy with economic theory, and then with concrete political proposals for what we can actually do in the here and now to fix all the fucking problems, of which there are many.
And like your book, it's super accessible without losing any nuance or rigor, which is a difficult combo, actually.
Yeah. And, it's always a difficult question when you're talking about a book at this level of ambition. It's like, do you actually try to like dot every single I and cross every single T, in which case the book will be 900 pages long and no one will read it. That's right. Unless you're Thomas Piketty and happen to get a huge burst of media coverage randomly? Or do you try to make it a little bit more, easily legible? And he opted for the latter option, which I think is probably the right one in most circumstances. People, generally don't read this the treatise style of thing. And but anyway, it's a serious book. It's not, it's not truncated, right. It's not dumbed down, and it's a good read. So,
and a good conversation to come in just a moment.
Yes. A great interview. But before we get to it, I got to remind listeners that we're sponsored by the American Prospect magazine here at Left Anchor Industries.
Working under the whip of David Dayen, right?
Yeah, send your emails or letters to Left Anchor Tower, 900 Broad Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So if you subscribe to our Patreon at the $10 a month tier, you'll get a free digital subscription to the magazine, plus our bonus episodes, plus our discounted print subscription. Subscribe at $5 a month and you'll get just the bonus episodes. Otherwise, enjoy the free stuff. Rate, review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you are on your podcasts. And, send it to your grandma. She'd probably enjoy it.
That's right. Absolutely. Well, appreciate you all. Enjoy the episode that'll come to you right now.
So, Mark, welcome to the show. Happy to have you. Your book is called Ends of Freedom, Reclaiming America's Lost Promise of Economic Rights. And, you kind of start off, towards the beginning talking about an economic bill of rights. And this is something that, famously has some resonance with, America's greatest president, Franklin Roosevelt, as our previous guest, Harvey Kaye, would be happy to talk your ear off about. But so can you explain, to start us off, your sort of framing of an economic bill of rights and how it differs from Roosevelt's conception of that?
Sure. So first of all, it's great to be here. Thank you so much. The book really tries to lay forth an economic bill of rights for the 21st century. Here we are, nearly 100 years after Roosevelt first introduced the original idea of an economic bill of rights as the culmination of the New Deal. This was his promise to the American people to truly secure freedom from want for each and every person living here in the United States. But I felt that the idea needed an update for two reasons. One is the economy has changed substantially. Over these past 100 years, we have these crazy things like the internet today. We're having this conversation over Zoom, for instance. We also, have a economy that's shifted substantially away from agriculture, which, accounted for more than a third of the workforce when Roosevelt was president. To today, here we have less than 1% of the workforce in agriculture, as just one example. And we're also dealing with different crises. The crises really at the forefront today, compounding the inequality crisis, the same issue Roosevelt was dealing with, is the crisis of climate change. And so I wanted to update the economic bill of rights and also try to reinsert it into the conversation. You talk to folks today and you ask them, what do Democrats stand for? And I think they're just going to shrug their shoulders and look confused at you. They might say not neoliberalism, but they're not going to tell you an affirmative vision, which I think is a real shame. And, here I think we have this opportunity to pivot Democrats and have them really talk about a comprehensive economic agenda to address both economic insecurity, which is rampant, and poverty, and to ensure that that vision is grounded kind of in the American tradition. And so the economic bill of rights that I lay out includes most of the economic rights that Roosevelt put forth, but I add two new ones, namely the right to a basic income and banking services and the right to a healthy environment, where I really address the environmental crisis. The other thing I should note, folks who hopefully pick up the book will see that there are a number of chapters that go through each of the rights that I propose, but I don't mean to say that these are the only rights we should be considering. I mean to start a conversation here. So one of the rights that gets kind of unfortunate, just a short discussion in the book is this idea of the right to a union, perhaps through the PRO Act or something stronger. And I think that's a right that absolutely needs to be at the forefront of our conversations, particularly given the resurgence of labor we've been seeing. I'm a professor at Rutgers University. We just went on strike. I feel so lucky to have been able to experience a strike as a worker and to feel the solidarity of my colleagues and the unions in our region that came and joined us on the picket line. And it was a tremendous learning experience, and we just had tremendous economic and job security gains for our most vulnerable workers at the university through that. So I think the right to a union, needs to be at the forefront of our conversations as we seek to rebuild.
Congrats, by the way.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
That's huge. That's huge.
I got to be on the picket line every single day. Let me say that is work. And it was a beautiful way to meet my colleagues. I've only been at Rutgers a year. And so I got to meet folks from all different departments across ranks, because you had non-tenure track faculty, adjuncts, grad students, and tenure track faculty all striking together, which was really one of the broadest and deepest strikes we've ever seen at a major university here in the United States.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, and I wanted to talk about this later, but since you brought it up, the right to an education being incredibly important, and as well as the right to a union. And I think that one aspect of that, which maybe tends to get lost in the mainstream discussion of stuff like strikes, is one of the principal focuses of the union, the organizers and the members, which is the preservation and functioning of the institution itself. And in my experience, talking with a lot of academics and being married to one, like the dysfunction of the academy is just like beyond belief. And yet you look at the prices, the amount of money that's being dedicated to educational institutions and especially universities, it's never been higher. And so part of these strikes, I think mainstream media tends to frame it as like, well, the grad students want more money. That's part of it, like we want, 10 years up, but we also want like the institution to still exist in 20 years, that there can be a thing called Rutgers that people can still go to, when you have retired and, the next generation of people are coming up. Maybe can you speak to that aspect of, the rights discussion in a way that's sort of like socially situated to where it's not just like sort of people demanding stuff from the government, demanding stuff from employers and whatnot. It's also about like the coherence of society and the coherence of institutions. I think is sort of subtext of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, one crucial question here is what does the government owe each and every one of us? And when we're talking about the government, we're not talking about some alien body or some imperial force. We're talking about the government of the people, for the people, by the people, as Lincoln put it. And so what does a government run for the people do with the economy? Well, I think that we need to move an economy away from focusing on short-term profits and extraction towards one focusing on promoting human flourishing. There's this ideal that we talk about a lot here in America, and it's this ideal of democracy. And what I really try to put forth in the book is that we just need to deepen democracy into the economic realm, not just talk about it in the political realm where it's under increasing stress and attack today. But we also need to, instead of just being on defense, be on offense and try to push that into the economic realm so that workers have a right to say in their workplace. So that's really what, the strike at Rutgers, for instance, was about worker security, as well as decent compensation. People need to be able to make a living wage. I mean, we have a president, we're talking about how expensive universities have gotten. We have a president who makes $1.2 million a year, plus gets a house and a car. While the grad students are making below $30,000 a year. So when you talk about how affordable college is, the number one place that we should be looking at is that administrative bloat, both in the number of administrators and in their salaries. When I was actually an undergraduate at UMass Amherst, my alma mater, I did an analysis when the administration was trying to hike tuition and fees on undergrads. And I just said, hey, if we had wage compression and lowered every administrator's salary to $250,000, would we be able to make up for the entire budget shortfall that they're saying, necessitated a tuition hike? And the answer was yes. You gonna tell me $250,000 isn't a decent salary for an academic administrator? I think it's just fine. So it actually brings us to one of Roosevelt's other brilliant points, which is if we want to ensure we have a well-functioning economy that doesn't allow for capture by the wealthy, in other words, oligarchy, which is where we find ourselves today, we need to not only talk about things like minimum incomes, but we also need to talk about things like maximum incomes. And Roosevelt actually put forth this idea that we need floors and ceilings in marketplaces in order to kind of embed the market in society rather than embed society in the market. And I think that's a really important switch that we need to make here in order to really put people at the center of the economy. And if we were to put a decent ceiling in the market, we can and should have a conversation about what that might look like. Maybe it's $425,000 as a maximum income, which is essentially what Roosevelt put forth, accounting for inflation today. Maybe it's a little bit less than that. Maybe it's, you're going to tell me, well, it should be 1 million or 2 million. I don't know the answer, but I think it's a conversation we should be having. And I think that's the type of conversation that ensures that the institutions within the economy start to actually function on a more equitable and level playing field, rather than, a bunch of us workers essentially being, more or less indentured servants for the Jeff Bezos and Elon Musks of the world who get to live like modern day kings.
Right. Absolutely. I really, first of all, Mark, enjoy your book so much because of it's a quite a balance of policy detail, history, political theory, as well as like sharp argumentation with bogus arguments that would seek to counter the ideas and proposals in it. Really just well done. Usually you have to have a trade-off for depth, but then the book is, you could use it as a doorstop, or you have something that's nice and concise, but the meat isn't there. So first of all, I found that really great. But being the theory guy, it's called the ends of freedom, and these rights for the 21st century, these economic rights, strike me as, let's get to the definition of freedom that we're appropriating here, because we have this struggle on the left, not just for an affirmative vision, as you said, but for combating the vision of the right. And part of this is redefining and reappropriating what freedom means. And it occurs to me that when you talked about introducing economic democracy and introducing democracy into the economy, we're also trying to understand that that's related to what you mean by positive freedom as against negative freedom, and that freedom, properly understood, is about democracy and is also about really flourishing more than just individualistic protection against tyranny or something, right? So can you talk a bit about that kind of theoretical framing that fits the history and the policies within it?
Yeah. So, freedom is the most powerful word in our political discourse, yet progressives have really completely ceded the word to conservatives for a reason that's just beyond my comprehension. And so, I got really interested in rethinking freedom about a decade ago. I did not go to school for political theory. I'm an economist by training. But I understand the power of the idea of freedom. And I was thinking to myself, freedom can't just be shrinking the government down to size where you can strangle it in the bathtub, as Grover Norquist essentially summed it up, right? That can't just be freedom. I mean, Thomas Paine, one of the most radical, perhaps the most radical founders, I think, put this so nicely, and arguing that, people don't join a society. They don't come into a society to have fewer rights than they did before, or which means to just simply ensure that government is minimized. They come in to ensure that government is there and is functioning for their well-being, and that they get to participate in that community as part of a member, be it as a voting individual or somebody who's actually in the government itself. And so I stumbled upon the work of Isaiah Berlin, an Oxford philosopher, who puts forth these two ideas of freedom, kind of negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom is the freedom we're familiar with today, and that dominates our conversations and in the American dialogue. And it's freedom from constraint, most famously outlined in the Bill of Rights. But let's remember, when the Bill of Rights were penned, the American people were rebelling against a monarchy. This is, that was their government. Today, our government is not a monarchy, though. If Trump takes the next election and Republicans continue with gerrymandering, I'm pretty concerned about, if we can still call ourselves some form of democracy at that point. But let's hope don't have to go down that road. Nevertheless, the founders actually had a much more nuanced and radical vision of freedom than what we give them credit for. People like Paine and Hamilton talk extensively about positive freedom. It's what your society owes you. And Paine actually goes into this in depth in Common Sense, which is the kind of the most incendiary pamphlet of the American Revolution, where he calls for things like, providing people with a cut of the wealth, not as charity, but a piece of the wealth simply as your citizen right, as your birthright for being a part of a society. And Paine believed deeply that in order to have a functional democracy, you needed some degree of economic equality. And I think he was absolutely right. And, that idea was carried forth through, the radical Republicans in Lincoln who engaged in widespread land redistribution, or through Roosevelt, who, essentially fought World War II for freedom. He put forth his famed 4 freedoms, one of which was freedom from want. And out of that came the Economic Bill of Rights that we're speaking about here today. But other famous American luminaries also carried this idea forward. Most famously, perhaps, is Martin Luther King, who fought not only for civil and political rights, but for economic rights. Yet we don't really talk about that as part of his legacy, which I think is a huge shame. It was the March on Washington for jobs and freedom, not just for the right to vote.
That's right. That's right. I want to real quick, though, drill in on this Isaiah Berlin thing real quick. You talk about this in the book a bit, because I don't know, I'm convinced I'm not a political theory guy. I'm not a theory guy of any kind. My brain barely works at the best of times. But I think that this distinction between negative and positive liberty sort of doesn't really hold up, especially when you're talking about libertarians, like Hayek. You mentioned Friedrich von Hayek. The famous libertarian Road to Serfdom guy, right? In the middle of World War II is like, if we do the welfare state, we're going to become a communist dictatorship. Somehow it didn't happen after we passed Medicare, but maybe, the effects have just been waiting to take form. But anyway, the libertarians like him, they're all about private property rights to have permanent bequeathable rights to a particular piece of ground or ownership shares in a corporation and that sort of thing. And like this negative liberty is the liberty of the state to not interfere with your ownership of these things. But when you get down to the functioning of how that actually happens, right? If you don't agree that this particular person, owns this particular piece of ground, like say you're a Native American, member of a, tribal grouping in the United States, and you don't agree with this, mining claim that a corporation that's just like thrown down according to like 150-year-old law on your ancestral homeland, then what happens in that case? Well, they'll send the cops after you, or the army. They'll use armed agents of state violence to prevent you from accessing that particular piece of ground. And so like freedom too, when you're talking about private property like that, the distinction just sort of like melds into itself. And I think in a way, as you suggest in your book, it tends to suggest that like, the sort of apparatus of coercion, including the state and the military and all the regulatory apparatus and everything else, ought to be, operated in such a way that it expands the lived freedom of everyone at the same time, rather than saying like this type of government coercion, we're just not going to talk about it. And this type of government coercion is going to get special distinction because now we're regulating, as opposed to when we set up the law and the courts and corporate law and labor law and securities law and all of that stuff. Can you tell listeners about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's really interesting when we actually unpack the ideas of Hayek and Friedman, who, kind of purport to just support this notion of negative liberty. But really what it is it's negative liberty plus, the police state plus, the white superiority. I think you could even go as far as in Friedman's case of arguing he was essentially a white nationalist. I mean, his writings are pretty troubling when it comes to particularly the public school system, plus the free market. So in order, they both understood that for markets to work, or what they deemed to be a free market, both of them know this notion of free market was never feasible, and that, the calling it a free market in the first place was purely a rhetorical device. But both of them knew that you needed a state actor in order to ensure private property rights for the right people, as you highlight, and to ensure that markets exist and actually function in the first place. And so, both of them supported state-sanctioned violence, particularly Friedman, to quite a substantial extent. Now, one thing I do want to highlight here, and it's pretty interesting, is, how moderate both the early Friedman and earlier Hayek were, particularly Hayek. I mean, Hayek supported a universal healthcare system. Friedman supported some form of a basic income. Granted, he wanted to get the welfare state writ large, but he did want government regulation of markets to actually support competition in his earlier writings. In 1951, he wrote this piece kind of outlining his original ideas on neoliberalism. And he was, kind of lambasted the original laissez-faire order as utterly failing. And the American people weren't going to buy it. And Friedman knew this. I mean, anybody in a shantytown or a breadline during the Great Depression saw that the quote unquote free market was a absolute myth and just led to mass immiseration. And so Friedman and Hayek were part of this group that was trying to invent neoliberalism to save classic liberalism, but augment it in a way that did not lead to socialism, but also did not lead to shantytowns and breadlines of the Hoover era. And so, this is where they ended up landing. Now, later on, particularly in Friedman's career, he hardened considerably and, basically said, even in terms of widespread market failures, like environmental crises, he thought the EPA wasn't worth its weight in paper. So Friedman really went to quite the extreme and started embracing, classic liberalism, exactly what he pushed against earlier in his career. But he also, he was a New Dealer too for a little while there.
Yeah, you see perhaps it's like a, no atheists in foxholes moment happening there, where it was like, these ideas are great in the abstract. And so, but once they blow the world up, then suddenly maybe we need to think twice about environmental regulation or dealing with depressions or, but once you've been fat and happy off of New Deal largesse for 30 years, then you can go back to the old medicine.
Yeah, Friedman couldn't get a job out of academia. He got a job with the government through the New Deal.
Ungrateful.
Talk about welfare queens, but this is important to drill down on, I think, Mark, because neoliberalism, as Quinn Slobodian and others have shown, is very much about using the state in order to privatize and expand markets. And maybe it's worth talking about, the right wing idea of freedom as access to markets, because really what it's about, when we privatize things in these ways, right? We're really doing, as Elizabeth Anderson said, creating private governments, private authoritarian governments, very often. And so, maybe we can talk about that because there's a lot of debunking of what the right's understanding of freedom really is that's required and that you do in your book. So we could just start going through it if you want.
Sure. So I'm really glad you brought in the work of Elizabeth Anderson because her work's been fairly influential in shaping my thoughts. And this notion of private government, I think, was really spot on. If we're trying to protect people from coercion, the idea that neoliberals put forth in the first place, what we see is that neoliberalism utterly failed on their own terms, because while it, might push to limit government scope minus the police state, it certainly did nothing to protect individuals from coercion by employers. And so really the neoliberal project just really fell flat in that front. And so I think that's important to lift up and to examine because, people are truly at the whim of their employers. They are in servitude to their employers. One of the reasons progressives fight for tight labor markets like we're in today is precisely to provide workers actual freedom, to provide them an actual exit option, where if you have a shitty employer who sexually harasses you or who won't let you take a bathroom break or who, punishes you for your political beliefs, you actually have the ability to say, screw you, I'm going to go somewhere else. That's actually freedom, right? The freedom to walk off the job. This is where I agree with Milton Friedman. He named his book Free to Choose. I agree with him. I would like people to be free to choose. The question is, how do we get there? The current economy is certainly not it.
And are the choices meaningful? And I think we'll get to how your proposals like the job guarantee and basic income, work together to provide meaningful choices. But just sticking with Elizabeth Anderson for a second, that you bring up a great quote, an analogy to Mussolini and fascism, because there's this right-wing talking point, which you just kind of debunked, because there's often not an exit. You can't actually find another job very often, depending on your situation. But the right wing likes to say, well, you can always quit. If your boss is a tyrant, you can always quit. And Anderson says, oh, okay. So just because people under Mussolini could like emigrate and leave the country, then Mussolini wasn't a fascist. Like that analogy doesn't hold water. It's still, we're describing the same type of behavior on the job, right?
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely right, and we can extend this into so many different spheres of the economy, like people's landlord. It's like you have a shitty landlord, just move. Well, first of all, the cost of moving is about $5,000 on average. When a third of Americans don't even have $400 to cover emergency expense, how are they supposed to move? And then, second of all, how are you supposed to find the time to move when you're holding down a job and a half, plus have kids that, don't have after school care and, have summers off with no paid child care and the like. So I think it's a false choice. And the question is, how do we provide people with real and meaningful choices to be and do what they have reason to value? That's what I want to get at here in this book is providing people with actual opportunities to live meaningful and dignified lives and not to be worried about where their next meal is going to come from, or are they going to have a roof over their head if they do follow their dreams. This American idea, follow your dreams. I mean, it's right. Bullshit. You follow your dreams and you end up at McDonald's flipping burgers. I mean, that's what that's going to, you're going to end up with in many instances.
And rolling the dice on cryptocurrency, like trying to just hit the jackpot. Right?
Yeah, that really worked out so well.
Yeah, my Dogecoin collection is going up, baby. It's guaranteed. Elon Musk told me so.
It can only go up.
I want to ask you though. You said, Mark, reason to value. That sounds to me like Amartya Sen. Are you influenced by him at all in your sort of thinking about like moral philosophy?
Yeah, the Amartya Sen and Nussbaum really influenced me quite a bit here. In my graduate studies, I read extensively both Marx and Sen, who are, two of the more foundational economists in my thinking. More recently, I really do want to give a shout out to Martin Hägglund, who wrote this beautiful book called This Life. That was perhaps my favorite book of the past 2 or 3 years that I've read. And it really just talks about how time is the most valuable thing we each have. And, precisely what the modern day capitalist system does is rob us of time to actually, do what we have reason to value, whether that's sitting on our couch, watching Netflix or playing the guitar or spending time with my 9-month-old. Or today I spent my whole day gardening. And let me tell you, that was a wonderful day. I could not think of a better way to spend my day, but I need some pretty good job security to be able to spend a Monday gardening, and relaxing. And that's the world we can and should have. I mean, Keynes wrote near 100 years ago, in this beautiful essay, The Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren, that we should all be working just 15 hours a day by now. And here we are working 47 hours a day on average in America, a month more than they do in Germany. And I think that's a great example of robbing us of our actual freedom.
A week, you mean? Yeah. But
no, a month. Yeah. Americans work a month more on average than Germany.
15 hours a week rather than.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for the correction.
We love Hägglund. We did a couple episodes on This Life, and and the Keynes essay was eerily accurate in its predictions of GDP and how capitalism would actually create the wealth necessary to have, that kind of leisure time. But he perhaps didn't understand, like maybe Marx did, how ideology functions. So that, like, with the increases in wealth and productivity capacity, workers would just be forced to work more. So that's why part of your book is so important, not just the policy proposals, but the understanding of not just mass politics, but the kind of theorizing necessary, to put those into action, to convince people that we deserve this future.
Well, right? Let's talk about that, though. Let's talk about policy because, it is, I wrote a paper for Matt Bruenig, the Leisure Agenda paper that was, part of it is just looking at what's happened to working hours in the United States as compared to European countries. and this and many other indicators, like about 1980, we're basically in the middle of the pack of rich countries, and then we just stop improving or start getting worse. Life expectancy, hours worked, all this manner of stuff. Everybody else is getting better except for us. But you wouldn't say Denmark is the Keynes utopia of 15 hours a week, but it's closer to it, a lot closer than the United States. We're talking about like an extra 10 weeks of vacation, something like that, depending on who's in first place at being the laziest country in the world. So can you tell us about your package of solutions here? You've got social housing, college, Medicare for all, basic income. We don't have to get into super close detail on all of this, but like sort of give us an overview of what you want to, change, and how they would sort of like fit together.
Sure. So, the economic rights try to cover the most crucial needs of the American people while acknowledging that the market's actually halfway decent at some things. So let me take food as one example. There's not a right to food in here because if people have, the right to work plus the right to a basic income, then, things like the right to food are actually, I think, fairly well covered. And let me just say a little bit more on that. I went to the grocery store today and, rhubarb was on sale. Now, why was rhubarb on sale? Because rhubarb's in season right now. And I think the grocery store does a decent job at telling me, what food I should be buying, and what what is in season and also providing me with choices. I mean, your average grocery store has over 60,000 options for American consumers. Now we could talk about how we have an unhealthy food system. We do. We can talk about how we need to price in the externalities associated with a lot of our, monoculture and our, CAFO system to raise animals, and we should. There's lots of improvements to be made. But I think in general, the market does a fine job at telling me if I should buy apples or oranges. What the market doesn't do a fine job at is things like ensuring I have healthcare or a job or a decent place to live. And so the economic rights cover the most important aspects of a person's life. So the first one is a right to work, which is ensuring that everybody has access to well-paying employment. This was the first right that Roosevelt put forth as well. And that could be done through a job guarantee program coupled with an expansion of the public sector. Here in the US, our public sector is less than half of the size it is in most Scandinavian countries and about half the size of what it is in France. And then finally, running the economy hot. Right now we're actually doing that, though the Fed is slamming on the brakes to the best of their ability with 10 consecutive rate hikes. But if we actually run a hot economy, we can have far more people in paid employment than they would otherwise. But, we can raise the minimum wage all day, but until we actually implement a job guarantee, workers don't have a guaranteed fallback position to leave their workplace. And so in work I've done with Sandy Darity, Derek Hamilton, and other colleagues, we've, really fleshed this notion out. The other rights, right to housing, people always talk about how gas is the most visible price in the economy. And it is. We drive by gas stations multiple times a day, for most folks. But housing is the most important price in the economy. I mean, it accounts for the majority of Americans as the largest budget item on a monthly basis. And unfortunately, what we see is that half of renters can't afford to pay their rent today in America, their rent burden, according to the government definition. And so a right to housing just ensures that everybody has floor under their feet and a roof over their head, and that we move the housing sector away from a nexus of profit to one of supporting homes and communities for people. Some of the other rights that I go through essentially acknowledge the market failures that exist. So earlier we talked about how we have to set, floors and ceilings in markets, essentially putting up bumper rails around markets. But there's other areas where just the market shouldn't play a role. And one example is healthcare, where we just need to flat out decommodify healthcare. There's no reason we should allow markets to play any role in the delivery of life-saving essential care that people require. And so in that case, I advocate for simply complete removal from the marketplace. As an economist, my job isn't only to talk about how to improve markets, but it's to talk about where markets aren't appropriate. And this is one of those areas. And it's why I think, people like Senator Bernie Sanders are right, and President Joe Biden's completely wrong in trying to advocate for something like a public option. We wouldn't get the benefits we would if we actually full out decommodify healthcare and transition it fully into the public sphere. And I think that that's a really important debate to be having. I know we won't have time to go into all the rights here, but perhaps we can dig into a couple of them.
Yeah, can I jump in? This is great. Because when you first started out talking about food and how the market does a good job, and then you went on to talk about market failures, how can we help people understand when the market does a good job of, basically determining what prices should be and giving us good information and facilitating what should be produced? Because this was Hayek's fear that instead of that, there would be, central planning and state planning and so forth. And yet, obviously, you're also talking about places where we need to, in fact, do planning and, central planning. There has to be state involvement and price controls and all these things. You also mentioned decommodification, and the concept of public goods, things that, as Polanyi, I don't know if you were referencing Polanyi when you were talking about subordinating the market to democracy, but there are things that are fictitious commodities that weren't created for the purpose of being sold, like human lives, like land, like nature. So how should we think about, aside from the particular proposals you're offering, but how conceptually should we think about what things should be planned or not subject to commodification versus those things that let the market kind of determine production and price? How do we think about those kind of differences with our lives? What parts of our lives should the state and our democracy be actively involved in determining what gets produced and how much it costs, or if it costs anything, versus subject to market forces?
Yeah, that is the $1 million or perhaps $1 trillion question, I should say. And it's a question that I wish I had the most clear and concise answer to for you. But it's one that I honestly continue to struggle with today. And I think it's easy to look at specific goods and services, but coming up with a grand theory to answer this question is something that, is continuing to evade me.
Or maybe put it a different way, but maybe this would be helpful. Like rent control, something like that. You get a lot of pushback. Now you make good arguments about why this is a different kind of good. And actually it's not true that supply won't increase if you have rent control. Like you would take on, the kind of empirical arguments about why there shouldn't be rent control. But are there some things like in principle, we don't actually care about the market consequences? We care about making sure everyone has a home, and sure, that'll bleed into how are you going to pay for it, which you talk about. But my concern here is not necessarily a grand unified theory, but are there some things that the state should provide? And it so happens that those things tend to also resolve economically in our favor in all these areas. But how do we determine when to cede the argument to empirics and be saves money to privatize, we should do that? Versus, well, in principle, how about we just ensure, if real, resource constraints don't obstruct it, everyone has these things, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think what we need.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And what I was, working towards earlier is this idea that, as a democracy, we need to decide what those goods are and what those services are. So I think the most obvious ones are the ones that I try to outline in the book, housing. People, you can't function if you don't have a home. And in the book, I bring up this conversation I had with Tiana Caldwell, a previously unhoused individual who, looked at me square in the face and said, look, you're never going to be productive on any level if you don't know where you're going to lay your head that night. And not only is it about being productive, but it's also just about having a humane society. Somebody else who really influenced my work quite a bit, was Harrington, who talked about, how being poor wasn't just one aspect of a person's life, but it is a person's life. And that, the really only human reaction to this can be just utter outrage. And I have to agree with Harrington here. I mean, it's why, you feel your stomach fall when you walk by a homeless person on the street, because you realize, like, what is our society doing and why? And homelessness, poverty, none of these things are necessary. These are tools of class warfare. They're not necessary to keep the economy functioning well. In fact, those are incredibly costly. Having people unhoused, having people unemployed, these are people that are not contributing to our society. That could have been doctors or nurses or teachers or chemists, you name it. And instead their lives are being, kind of wasted, both for them personally, which is a moral outrage, but also, for the broader benefit of society. But to get back to your question, how do we think about what goods and services? I mean, I really mean that I think this is a question of democracy, that we as a society need to decide, what things belong in the public realm and what things belong in the private realm. And then, where is the in between? Now, most of the economy exists in a gray space. So I talked about agriculture earlier and how it does a fine job at telling me if I should buy apples or oranges. But guess what? All of those things are heavily regulated and subsidized by the government too. I mean, agriculture is probably the most planned sector of the economy, thanks to the Farm Bill. And I think we need drastic improvements to it. And so, the question is how do we have an economy? How do we have a government that guides the economy to serve the public interest? And that's going to mean far more managed economy than what we see today. Today, we have we have a managed economy. It's just managed for different class interests than what I fight for in the book.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could drill down a little bit more on healthcare, because I feel like that's a kind of more concrete example of just what you were talking about, where the inapplicability of markets really comes to the fore, because you just think about markets as a technology. Well, you ration the availability of the service by price. And what that means is if you're somebody with like a low income or medium income or even like quite a high income in certain cases, and you have a very expensive condition that requires a lot of complicated labor and technology to treat, and that service is allocated by price, you don't get it and you die. And that's very different. You just like we talk about health insurance, and people think about it maybe in terms of like home insurance, but they're very different. These are very different services. Home insurance, you pay what you are statistically expected to collect over the life of your property. It may work out for you, individually, but it should, you have the, statistical likelihood of you making a claim on your insurance plus some profit for the insurer. But when you have health insurance, there must be systematic transfers from healthy to sick if you don't want people to die for lack of money. And like, I feel like that just basic fact, that people could just have a turn of bad luck, get hit by a car or something like that, require, massively expensive surgeries, and just be like, well, looking at your bank account, oh, you're $10 short, you're dead. And that just wildly unjust outcome. I think that, just illustrates that. And, maybe you could talk about some other ways in which markets can be dysfunctional in this, type of context. It illustrates exactly what you're talking about. Markets are nice technology. They work very well in certain circumstances. They work really terribly in other circumstances. And it's the process of democracy is just to figure out where do we want them to apply, and where is it best for the citizenry as a whole.
Yeah. So, the thing about healthcare is it's the most straightforward no-brainer to straight up decommodify. Market failures in healthcare are everywhere. I mean, any well-functioning markets within the healthcare system simply don't exist. I mean, I challenge you to find them. So, just to provide a few examples, I mean, if we were to transition away from the current healthcare system, which takes up roughly $1 in $5 within our gross domestic product, I mean, it sucks up a tremendous amount of, both American labor and American wealth. If we were to transition away from our current system to a single payer system, First of all, it will be substantially cheaper because given how complex our system is, the amount of money wasted trying to navigate it is just astronomical. Second of all, we would be able to cover everybody, truly everybody, whereas today, despite the passage of the Affordable Care Act, we still have 1 in 4 Americans either uninsured or underinsured. This drastically affects, human well-being. I mean, U.S. life expectancy is 28th out of 36 in the OECD, right next to countries like Estonia and Czech Republic. These are countries that have incomes of like roughly half of ours. Yet we're way down the list precisely because of how we've structured the market. Now, I go to the doctor and the doctor tells me, oh, you need to go get an MRI on your shoulder. And I call up 2 places and I make an appointment. It might be the case that one place the MRI is only $4,000 and the other place the MRI is $15,000. I have no idea. Do you ever ask how much your healthcare costs? I don't. I don't know about the rest of you, but that's not one of the questions I tend to ask. And it's precisely because we have this insurance system. But because we have a kind of free-for-all, prices are just all over the board because they're just not transparent whatsoever, which leads to just huge amounts of waste and bloat in the system. Another example is when you're actually getting direct care. I mean, when you need life-saving care, you don't care what it's going to cost, but are you going to sit there and negotiate? Well, is this anesthesiologist that's about to put me down after my car accident? Are they in my network? Because if not, you might be forced, to pay a $20,000 bill later on. This happens, unfortunately, time and time again. I mean, medical debt is one of the leading causes of bankruptcy here in America. And so the examples are pervasive for rampant market failures in the healthcare system. Whereas, we have lots of examples from other countries that show us that healthcare functions quite well when essentially, run on a single payer type system. The other thing I want to note here too, what I try to do in the book is not just provide the economic rationale for, why something like universal healthcare makes sense and debunk kind of the common critiques associated with Medicare for All type program, but also to provide some history. Medicare for All was the original idea behind Medicare. The original legislation was intended to be a universal healthcare system. And unfortunately, they didn't have the votes. And so they whittled it down to healthcare for the elderly. And one of the key architects said, well, next year we'll win kiddie care and we'll get universal healthcare for everybody under 18. And within 5 years, we'll get true universal healthcare. And that was the idea. And, here we are, 60 plus years later. And we don't even have kiddie care yet. Although I actually think that would be a good place, for us to start the conversation in terms of expanding Medicare. Kids are cheap because in general, they're fairly healthy and who can be against providing healthcare for kiddos?
Absolutely. Yeah. I favor that. Yeah. Advance in the most demagogic possible fashion. If you don't support kiddie care, you're literally in favor of child murder. In the context, maybe again in terms of healthcare, a good window into the like final part of your book, which is about how are you going to pay for that? That's actually the title of my book, which is rather similar to yours in some disturbing ways. Great minds think alike. In fact, that's what I'm going to conclude.
It's like when Einstein and others had E equals MC squared at the same time in their minds. He just got there first. Like
Darwin,
kind of cosmic wisdom that you guys tapped into.
Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, discovering evolution at the same time. In fact, as good collectivists, I actually say this in my book, nobody ever figures anything out by themselves ever, it's always bubbling around in society. Anyway, how do we pay for it? You say healthcare, American healthcare, it's the most expensive in the world. And it's also dog shit. We have like C- healthcare and we're paying triple premium luxury Hilton, grand platinum plus prices for it, like another 5 points of GDP, like $1 trillion a year, for insurance that doesn't even cover everybody. So, you talk about in the book money versus real resources, versus like how could you actually concretely move towards this type of much more generous social state? So can you sort of run us through the basic logic of that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the question that constantly comes up whenever progressives say they want to make sure that everybody has nice things. And it's like, yeah, we'd love to give everybody a pony, but you're just going to bankrupt the nation and everybody will be poorer for it. Well, as an economist, I can tell you that they're wrong. And indeed, we can afford nice things for everybody. I mean, I like to think of myself a little bit as a bougie socialist. I do like nice things, and I do think we can all have them in moderation. Every one of us can have a nice place to live. Every one of us can have health care. Every one of us can have a job and, a place in our town to go see the theater and so much more. We just need to will it into existence and collectively work to make it happen. So how do we actually pay for these things? Because it's an important question that we can't simply wave away. So, as you highlight, I think there's two important distinctions we need to make when that question gets asked. One is where will the dollars come from? And two is where will the real resources come from? And what I contend in the book is the first question is the easy part. The second question is the legitimate challenge. So let's talk about the first part. Where does the money actually come from first? And, here I outline kind of a number of ways in which we can pay for an economic bill of rights, which I want to be honest about, will be expensive. These are big, bold proposals that are going to require substantial investment by the federal government. And, the first and most straightforward thing is we need to move our current federal spending away from subsidizing violence and extraction and towards subsidizing human flourishing. The authors of the Freedom Budget, who essentially wrote a very similar, call for an economic bill of rights. This was authored by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin with a foreword by King as the centerpiece of the Poor People's Campaign following the passage of the Civil and Voting Rights Acts. They got this and they basically tried to outline the fact that, the federal budget is a moral document that shows our national priorities. So we need to change our national priorities. This means reorienting some of our spending. The other two areas is that taxes will go up on people. Now, let me explain something, though. That doesn't mean you're worse off. That doesn't mean you have less money in your pocket at the end of the day. And this is what infuriates me about the narrative here. There was this calculator that Vox put out during the 2016 presidential election that just showed everybody getting poorer under people like, Senator Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton's policies. But the problem is that they're only tallying up half the equation. They forgot about this whole thing of benefits, that you actually get something for paying your taxes. So let me use myself as an example. I have a good job. I am a tenure track faculty at a major university. And guess what? I pay $830 a month for my health insurance, and it sucks. Okay? It absolutely sucks. Now, if we transition to a public health insurance system and my tax bill goes up $500 a month, but all of a sudden I don't need to pay $830 a month towards healthcare premiums, let alone my, $5,000 deductible and copays and all the other things that come along with it, I am financially better off. I have better, more secure health insurance and more money in my pocket at the end of the day. So taxes going up is not necessarily a bad thing. We need to think about this in a comprehensive way, not just simply say taxes up are bad. So that's, kind of one example. There will be broad-based tax increases for some of the programs. The final thing is, tax the rich. We talk a lot about, when I teach economics, I teach my students about this thing called a Pigovian tax. And for a second, their eyes glaze over. And then we start talking about carbon taxes and they become slightly interested. It's a tax on negative externalities. Pollution is a good example of a negative externality. But the rich are also a good example of a negative externality. So taxing the hell out of the rich is not only going to free up economic space to do important things, but it also protects our democracy from the Elon Musks and the Donald Trumps, although Donald Trump's not actually rich. So, I'm not sure how much he'd have to pay here. The Jeff Bezos of the world, and in a way that not only makes us on a better economic footing, but also, protects our political system. And that's how you pay for it. It's really not that hard. The hard part is the real resources. We're going to need to train a hell of a lot more nurses and doctors and teachers and hopefully college professors, and more. And that will be a complicated, but I think completely manageable system. But that's where, economists should be turning their minds. They did this in World War II. This is where, input-output tables, kind of originated, which is figuring out how do we make sure we have enough steel to build enough bombers to defeat Nazi Germany. The questions today are different. How do we build enough solar power, and wind turbines to ensure we don't burn our planet to, down to the ground? And how do we make sure we have enough houses to ensure that nobody lives on the streets? They're different questions, but, it's essentially the same idea.
I wish we could tax fascists and neoliberals out of existence because they're negative externalities too. It occurs to me, we just have a few minutes left, so there's so many things we could get to, but you are one of the few, like Jeff Spross, that are not caught in the binary job guarantee, basic income, job guarantee, basic income. Why not both? Spross says, and you argue as well. Well, it seems so obvious to me that they go together well. Maybe you could talk a bit about why those who don't think that goes together well are missing something. Why are the job guarantee and basic income, like peanut butter and jelly? Yeah,
it's a great question. And I'm going to say I'm a little guilty here because when I first started working on these questions, I was a little bit in the job guarantee camp. And, the reason I was a little bit in the job guarantee camp, just for a bit of background here, is because I think a tremendous amount of dignity comes through work in our current society. Now that could change, right? But society's changed slowly. And right now,
or it should. It should if you have a good job.
Yeah,
right?
It should. It absolutely should. But hey, I'm a national park enthusiast. And when I go walk around our stunning national parks and I see something that was built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, that is pride right there. I mean, we can build beautiful things for, ourselves, for our families, and for future generations to enjoy. And for those of us that are willing and able to partake, I think that is great. Now, that said, there isn't an either or. It's a complete false trade-off. And it's because people fall into the trap of scarcity. It's that we don't have enough. We have to choose one or we have to choose the other. And I just fundamentally reject that notion. I mean, we should have a job guarantee to provide well-paid employment for everybody who's willing and able to work. And for folks who choose not to work or are unable to work for some reason, we should have a basic income. This means that caregivers, for instance, are also rewarded for their work. That's just not technically market work. It's still work. I mean, I have a 9-month-old. I take care of him all the time. And let me tell you, it is hard work. Some days I'd rather be in the office, or teaching my students than on baby duty all day. I mean, it is brutally hard work sometimes and also incredibly rewarding, to be sure. But a basic income recognizes that everybody needs to be able to purchase basic goods and services, regardless of if they're working or not. And we are a rich society. We can afford to do that. I mean, we are so rich. If wealth was distributed equally in this country, each and every one of us would have $500,000. If income were distributed equally, we'd each have $95,000 a year to our name. So I think we can afford a modest basic income to, ensure nobody goes without. The one other person I will just briefly mention who also believed these go together like peanut butter and jelly is Martin Luther King. I mean, he strongly advocated for both in his career, and had both as key parts of his economic reform agenda.
Yeah. Yeah. People forget that about MLK, that, he won, with the assistance of many others, the civil rights legislation, and then he moved on towards economic stuff, and he became dramatically less popular. But I think that what you're just saying now is much more accurate now even than it probably was in the 1960s, insofar as that doing what you suggest would benefit the vast majority of the population, even up to middle class, white collar college professors, and journalists like myself, just raise my taxes by 10% and give me Medicare. I will take that deal in a heartbeat. And
Well, these problems that you point out are disproportionately affecting, of course, people of color, women, the most vulnerable, the elderly, the disabled. The universal solutions also close those gaps that particularly harm those groups. And so I think people forget that as well, that it's for everyone, but also it addresses these particular needs, right?
Targeted universalism is what we call it. That's exactly right. I mean, look, Wilbur Ross, who's one of the key architects of the New Deal, had this great quip, which was, programs for the poor make poor programs. And I think he was absolutely right. And so the question is, how do we all have nice things while simultaneously narrowing the gap? How do we, we not only just want to set that floor, but we want to squeeze inequality and kind of have a much greater degree of convergence than we've had. I mean, we kept being told this story that, economic growth will result in convergence both within and between countries. And it's all bullshit. It's never happened. It's never gonna happen without, serious policy efforts.
Well, can I put a bow on this, or have you put a bow on this by my last question? You obviously are writing in line with the great Harvey J. Kaye and his work on American history, because part of what your book shows is that this vision, this positive agenda, this future that we could have is actually in keeping with the promise of the country. And there's a tradition over our history, throughout, not just of the white supremacists, not just of the Lochner era and the neoliberals, but also of the understanding of freedom and democracy that you're pushing for here. So we need to draw on our history, don't we, to understand the future that we deserve? Something like that?
We do. We have dark and troubled times in our history, and we have beautiful ideas that we have fought for in this country, and we need to reclaim it. We can't just walk away from the brilliant ideas of the Thomas Paines and the, Lincolns and, the like. Roosevelt, I think, was standing on the shoulders of giants, as were those who came, after him. I mean, in writing this book, I did not invent most of these ideas. I am borrowing these ideas from many brilliant thinkers that came before me and trying to put them together in a package that, fits the political moment, and tries to intervene in our debate to actually put forth a post-neoliberal agenda that I hope people can rally behind. And this isn't just a Democrat or a Republican issue either. We actually did some polling on the Economic Bill of Rights, and the majority, not just of Democrats, but of independents and Republicans, strongly support an Economic Bill of Rights for the 21st century. And what's amazing is even when we outline the exact programs, and, take it away from the abstract. In the abstract, do you support universal healthcare? When we actually ask them, do you support, a Medicare for all type program, a job guarantee type program, and provide the details? The vast majority of Americans support each and every one of these rights. People get it. And I think that it's time that we run on a agenda that actually, protects and serves the American people. And just to your earlier point about, this isn't just for poor people. The bottom 90% of Americans are going to be better off under these programs. And in fact, those in the 90th percent and the 98th, 99th percent might not be better off financially, but let me tell you, they'll be better off in a lot of other ways, because we'll live in a much less unstable, much, more democratic and much safer society when we actually take care of one another than the world we find ourselves in today. Now, the top 1% or 1/10 of 1%, I'm fine with them doing a little worse.
Yeah. I'd say maybe as a closing comment that I think being a hyper billionaire like Elon Musk is maybe one of the worst things that could happen to somebody.
That's right.
You can't relate to anybody. You have no real friends. You end up inevitably surrounded by yes men and toadies who are trying to extract your, to just get money from you by hook or by crook. And you alienate yourself from the broader community outside of, your social groups. You can't relate to Jeffrey Q. Cornhusker in Iowa. It's like you live in completely different universes, and that's unhealthy for anybody. We're social beings, and we need to have real relationships to be healthy mentally and physically. And, Surgeon General report just came out a couple days ago, said loneliness is as bad as smoking for your health. And I can't, it's hard to imagine, being more lonely than a ultra billionaire. So yeah, we gotta raise taxes to the top marginal tax bracket up to 94%, where FDR put it, if not higher, for the good of society and for the good of the ultra billionaires who will be thrown down into the pit of muck with the rest of us pigs and learn to be human beings once again. And I look forward to meeting Elon down there in the slop with the rest of them.
where he can finally have actual freedom and be actually part of human flourishing, right, in society.
But Mark Paul, the book is called Ends of Freedom, Reclaiming America's Lost Promise of Economic Rights. Thanks for coming on the show.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
It's coming out May 12th, everyone, May 12th.
And thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you in the next episode.